Hello.
Hi.
Tom, does anybody here know what a community garden is? Has anybody heard about it?
Me?
A couple of people?
I have.
What do you know about them?
Well, there's not many in Fresno. There used to be some, but then I guess nobody in the community really attended to them.
Right.
So they got shut down, and they're planning to start another community garden here in Fresno then.
Well, there is one that's going in on Belmont near Poplar, right over here off the edge of the Lowell district.
Oh, I knew that.
But actually there are probably 30 to 40 community gardens in Fresno. And what community gardens are for primarily is for people to grow food. There's a wide variety of community gardens. A lot of people like to garden, but they don't have land. Maybe they live in an apartment or something like that. It helps them augment their food budgets. So instead of spending money on food, they can just grow the food. People also grow flowers and, I mean, all different kinds of things in community gardens. So what I'm here to do today, I guess you guys have a project about community gardens coming up.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm going to help you understand a little bit of what you need to take into account when you're designing your community garden. So I put some resources online for you guys to check out. Some of those resources have to do with designing a community garden. Some have to do with some of the things you need to think about when you're designing the community garden, not just the shape of it, but some of the other aspects. And some have to do with planting. So resources around planting, what seeds to get, what to grow together, what not to grow together. And I also brought a few books for Mrs. Keeler to leave here in the classroom. So if you guys want to check them out here in the room. There's one in particular that is pretty academic and scientific, and so it may or may not work really well for the geometry aspect of what you're doing. So when you are trying to build a community garden and start a community garden, is that right? Did I do this
Yeah, just
right?
do another one. Oh, I think you're going backwards.
I am?
No, you want to go the other way.
To the right.
This way?
Yeah.
There you go.
Sweet. I want one of these.
Yeah.
A couple of the things that you need to take into account, number one, is what is the purpose of your community garden? All right? I'm not used to writing on this either, so it feels strange to me. I'm sorry. So the purpose of your community garden, is it going to be just to grow food?
Oh, there's a right click. You want to, if you click the button, that's right click. So just click away from it. Tap. There you go.
All right. To grow food? Is it going to just be green space for the community to gather? What are some of these things that you're going to think about? Who are the gardeners? Okay. So I work for a nonprofit called Fresno Metro Ministry, and one of the things we do is we work on social justice issues. So the department that I work under is a hunger and nutrition department, and so something to think about. I don't know what people know about poverty in Fresno, but it's approximately 30% of our population in Fresno lives below the poverty line. The poverty line is $22,000 a year. So I don't know if that means anything to anybody here, but that's not a lot of money. And so when we are considering where we're going to place a community garden, we really want to try to place it in an area that it can positively affect the community. So we take something like poverty into account. Like, we're not going to go out to Copper River and try to build a community garden. Those folks have the means to build their own community garden if they want to. But a place like Lowell area, which has a high rate of poverty in it, they don't have the means to build it. So we tried to help figure out a way to build a garden there, so the people that live in that neighborhood can actually grow some food for themselves. So figuring out who are your gardeners. Finding a piece of property, that's going to play into who are your gardeners quite a lot. Are you going to put it in the middle of a neighborhood? Are you going to put it next to a bunch of stores in a big empty field? How are those people going to get to that site? who are your gardeners? Are you going to draw the neighborhood in to help you build the garden? Are you going to try to build it and hope that people in the neighborhood are interested? All those kinds of things. The shape of the property. Is it, we've got a house here, a house here, and an empty lot in between. How much shade comes onto this lot, and for how long? So vegetables need at least 8 hours of sun a day in order to grow. So if they're not going to, if you have a site that's totally shaded all the time, you're not going to be able to grow vegetables, and there's not much point in putting your garden right there. So figuring out where the sun's coming from, how long it's on the site, all that kind of stuff is going to be really important. Now when you go to design your garden, taking into account what the gardeners are going to need, what sorts of things are you going to put on there? You're going to put a tool shed. Do you need shade structure for people to cool off under? Do you want a compost area? Different things like this. And then when you design the garden, do you just want to do boxes like this? Do you want to try interesting shapes? How are they all going to fit? The one at the Lowell Garden, for instance, it's a big lot like this. But the freeway runs across it like this. So this entire area is in the shade. So nobody's going to be able to grow anything under there. And we have a strange line cut across this. So I can't put any plots right there. So all these plots that are going to be next to this are going to have to be triangles. So is it worthwhile for me to put a bunch of triangles right here? Are those going to be decent plots for somebody to grow food in? You never really know. We're planning over at this site to have an area for an orchard and vines for people to have some fresh fruit as well. And those would be like community type areas. Take those kinds of things into account. Now if you start putting trees in there, you wouldn't want to plant a whole bunch of trees in the middle of your community garden, because everything around them is going to get shade. But you might want to, if you determine that this area right in the middle with all these trees is going to have benches for people to sit under. So a shady spot might be perfect. So there's all these different kinds of things that you can take into account when you're doing this and designing your garden. Does anybody know anything about plants? How to plant them? How much room they need? What kind of chemicals they need? What ratios those chemicals need to be? Anybody ever done any of that?
Don't you have to like buy them at the some cat food and stuff like for it?
Yeah,
Back water or something like that?
yeah, you can do all different kinds of things. Well, like back guano, for instance, is really high in nitrogen. So plants that don't need high nitrogen, you don't want to put a whole lot of back guano on them. Something that might need a lot of potassium or phosphorus, you're going to need to think about that when you're amending the soil. So your different fertilizers, things like that, depending on what you're growing. Another thing to kind of think about, keep going I guess, huh? There we go. When you're trying to figure out how much food you're going to be able to produce in your entire garden, it depends on how you grow. So let's say that each one of these lines, when we drive down the freeway or whatever, we think about a farm, we see these big long rows like this. And we see plants placed along these big long rows. Well, the reason why we have all this with these long rows is because a tractor needs to drive through it. Right? So you need all this space for your wheels. But when we garden, we're not driving tractors through anything. So if we say that these plants each need 1 foot in between each other, we'll put our first row down here. But instead of going over to the next one, we go in on an angle. So now, well, you know, whatever, it's a sketch. So now this is like this. And then we can, that's just not looking right, but hopefully you guys are getting what I'm talking about. Straight pin. So what we have in between these plants is a foot in between them, but they're on angles. So you're actually in the same space, you're getting an entire extra row of plants in there. You're growing a ton more food. Hopefully that's making sense. And then in between all these things, you can put, say you're going to plant cucumbers. Cucumbers take a little while to grow, right? They need to vine up on something, and they're going to provide shade for everything underneath it. You can't grow vegetables well in the shade, but you can grow things like lettuce, radishes, things that grow really, really fast underneath here. So now you've got another crop that you're pulling before your cucumber plants are so big they're shading everything out. So you need to think about what you can plant and where. So when you're designing a garden plot to try to determine how much food you're going to grow, you need to seriously think about spacing, little plants, big plants, how far apart they need to be, all that kind of stuff. Some of these books over here that I brought will help you do that. There's a couple of books here that are really good about companion plants. Some plants, when you plant them next to each other, will work against each other. Other plants will help each other. So for instance, dill is something that we use, that's an herb that we use. It's an easy thing to plant, but not a whole lot of plants will grow well with dill. But dill is a good thing to have in your garden because it keeps pests out. So you don't need to plant or use a lot of pesticides, right? So it's cheaper and easier. This one, pretty simple, square foot gardening, makes a lot of sense. Talks a lot about how to grow a lot of food in a small amount of space. All about square foot gardening, so that'll be a good resource. This one's the one I was talking about. This one is chock full of information. This has ideas in here, how to plant a garden over several years, what to plant when. Tells you about yields of different kinds of plants, how much you can expect to get out of it, how much you need to plant and when. It's got spacing for your plants. It's a pretty hardcore book. So, when it comes to gardening, I would say. So use these as resources for you. Does anybody have any questions about designing a community garden?
Anyone have a question?
You don't have to have questions.
It's okay. Well, they haven't started into their project too much yet, so maybe, would you mind putting your email up?
Definitely.
Let me stop the video.
I brought some cards around